Good morning and welcome to this session of the Triton Leaders Conference, Empowering Social Change Through the Arts. I'm just going to review some quick housekeeping tips with you and our principles of community, and then we'll get started with our great speakers. You all have entered in with your microphones on mute, so we're going to keep it that way just to minimize any background noise. Also, we ask that you use the chat feature to enter any questions that you may have for our speakers during the session. Once we get to Q&A, I will read those questions aloud to our speakers for them to be able to answer. We also ask that you consider and abide by the UC San Diego principles of community, which are providing fair treatment for faculty, staff, students, and of course our entire Triton community, encouraging a climate of fairness, cooperation, and professionalism, fostering inclusiveness, respect, and a welcoming environment, as well as promoting collaborative attitudes and actions. We thank you so much for being here today, and I'll turn it over to Jimmy to kick off the program.
Thank you, Eliza. So thank you so much for coming to the Empowering Social Change Through the Arts program panel discussion. We are joined by a group of awesome panelists that I can't wait to hear from. I'm Jimmy Kong. I will be moderating this session for you. I am also going to be a panelist during this discussion because I'm I focus in the arts as well. So a brief description about myself. I am an Asian male wearing a black button-down shirt, sort of shortish kind of hair with glasses that are like square. I'm calling in from Santa Rosa, California. And basically, my position at the university right now is actually the disability specialist, one of the disability specialists at the Office for Students with Disabilities on campus. I have been legally blind since birth, and I graduated from UC San Diego with a bachelor's degree in music and visual arts media. When I'm not working at the OSD, prior to the pandemic, I was a DJ. So I would DJ campus events or even private events like weddings, dances, etc. So enough about me. Let's hear from some of our panelists. So Michael, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. First of all, I want to thank UCSD, Triton, for inviting me to be a part of this panel. I'm very honored. My name is Michael Torres. I'm a screenwriter, filmmaker, producer, and I graduated in 2007, which means I'm an old man now. Let's see, what else? Oh, in 2005, I won the Samuel Goldwyn Writing Awards. I was the first undergrad to win that award. So my mom made me promise I would mention that. Anyway, that's about it for me.
Sure. Yeah, welcome, Michael. Next, Kent, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, and thanks everyone for having me. My name is Kent Lee. I'm a UCSC alumnus, also from 2007. Currently, I run a media arts nonprofit organization called Pacific Arts Movement, which is best known perhaps for presenting the San Diego Asian Film Festival here in San Diego for just over 20 years, and otherwise fairly active within the local Asian Pacific Islander community. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Kent. Regan, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes. Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me as well. I'm Reagan Linton. I'm an actor, writer, director, and currently artistic director of a theater company in Denver, disability affirmative theater company called Family Theater Company. I am a graduate of the Department of Theater and Dance. I got my MFA in 2013 and also do a lot of work around equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility in theater, film, TV worlds. And I'm coming to you from Denver, Colorado, the traditional homelands of the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho people. And I am a nearly 40 white woman with short blonde hair, a green colored shirt on today, and sitting in front of some open windows in my kitchen. So thanks for having me.
Thank you. So I have a couple of questions prepared for the panelists. So the first question that I would like to ask is, describe your art medium that you primarily work in and how you ensure that your artwork is inclusive and accessible to all audience members. So to begin, I will provide an answer to this first, which is I mostly work in the media, art medium, so video, audio, and web content design. So when I actually have my personal type of projects, I like to put my viewers into my shoes as a visually impaired visual media producer. As working at the Office for Students with Disabilities, I have been pushing a different type of focus. Now, the focus is basically talking to campus departments and also campus organizations about the importance of captioning and audio description on their content. The reason why this is very important is because, say, for example, someone is, well, let's just lead with, a lot of people think captioning is for people with deaf and hard of hearing. That is not the case because maybe somebody needs captioning because they're an English language learner, or if they're a visual learner that wants to be able to read what the presenters are saying. So that's why it's very important to have captioning on your content. And then audio description, you might think, oh, it's for blind and low vision people. Yeah, sure, it is for that. But however, it's also for people who might be preoccupied around the house, like they might be cooking, they might be cleaning, or anything like that. And then basically they can't look at the screen. Well, they can turn on audio description and then their visual content becomes a podcast that they can be listening to. So that's what I've been doing basically around the Office for Students with Disabilities to promote inclusivity around the whole campus. So to start this conversation, Michael, would you like to describe the art medium you primarily work in and how you ensure that your artwork is inclusive and accessible to all?
Yeah, so my art medium is film, movies. It's one of those art mediums that's pretty much, I would say, universally accessible, as long as you have, like, what you mentioned, captioning, and language availability. But other than that, I think pretty much everyone can watch a movie. There's programs that caption things for the blind and the deaf. And so what I do is look at from a creative standpoint and try to bring visibility to my art through the stories that I tell and try to inform the audience about the disabled experience. And that's how I try to make things more accessible. And by giving people the opportunity to produce content with me that are disabled, behind the camera as well as in front of the camera. So there's not a lot of opportunities for disabled people as well as women, people of color, and other minorities behind the camera. And I don't think it's much of a surprise that Hollywood is very dominated by white males, cisgender people. So I try to do my part like that.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing. I actually had the privilege to watch one of Michael's films, and I thought it was a very interesting, definitely very interesting and very eye-opening. So, yeah, thank you for sharing. Kent, would you like to talk about your art and how it's inclusive and accessible to all?
Sure. So Pacific Arts Movement, our main function during the year typically is through the San Diego Asian Film Festival. And so obviously most of our work is revolving around media arts and presented through film. And frankly, at the end of the day, we see film as being a tool in which we're trying to shape and build community with. And so when you're thinking of using it as a tool, in that sense, we think of inclusivity and accessibility in so many different ways. It could be cultural and ethnic diversity. It could be thinking about income access and whether cost is, prohibitive for people to actually participate. We even think about timing, when you play film and when you make it accessible, makes a difference for who can actually enjoy it. Because we do a lot of work that is, requiring a physical location, at least up until this last year, we also really need to consider things like geographic diversity and, also just from an age standpoint. And these are all factors that we try to consider both in terms of the planning and also in the implementation of the work that we have. And so when it comes to planning, a lot of it is about, because we're playing so many films that are often from different cultures, languages, that some may be captioned and some may be not. We have to think about how those are going to be accessible to any, audience member that might be attending. But then also a lot of our work is really done from an outreach standpoint. So in order for us to actually be inclusive, we have to think about how we actually engage particular communities that may not otherwise have the opportunity to participate. And a lot of that is done by finding partners within local communities that might represent some of these elements that I've discussed so that we can get a broad, diverse and inclusive audience that participates. So, yeah.
Excellent points. Definitely, it's awesome to hear that. Reagan, would you like to talk about your art and how it's inclusive to your, how you make it inclusive to all your audience members?
Yeah, so I guess I'll talk about a couple different approaches. First, myself as artistic director. So family, it's with a PH, PHAMALY. That's because it was originally founded in 1989 as the Physically Handicapped Amateur Musical Actors League. It's a real mouthful. A lot of those parts of the acronym don't apply to what we do anymore. Particularly that it was, really focused around physical visible disabilities, actors with physical visible disabilities. Now that's shifted and really broadened. So we just go by Family Theater Company. And I think as artistic director there, the company's always been around how do we include, first and foremost, artists with disabilities to be able to get on stage, to be able to do their work and remove the barriers that exist so that they can just be actors. And then beyond that, yeah, going to the audience, going to other artists, backstage artists, designers, how do we build an inclusive and accessible experience for them? So that can look like, a lot of our typical protocols are ensuring that we have wheelchair access to our spaces. We have Braille and alternative options for how we're presenting written materials, our playbills, things like that. We have sensory and tactile tours, sensory stories when people are coming in. We are making sure that costumes have accessibility so that if you don't have good finger dexterity, we're able to adapt and use Velcro so that you're not trying to deal with fasteners. So it's really, really broad things, audio description, ASL interpretation, captioning, but then all the way down to the little nuances of what actually builds an accessible experience for people in the space, in the experience. I think one main principle that I've always come in with is that, I come to disability and that experience through having been injured in a car accident. I'm a paraplegic, I use a manual wheelchair, but realizing disability, quote unquote, can mean so many different things for so many different people. We put so many diverse humans into that category. And that goes for humans in general, right? Regardless of what our kind of social identities are. So I think we just try to build a very adaptive, flexible environment where we can always try to meet somebody where they are and learn from them what is going to be their most successful engagement in the space. And then I'll just say, as an individual artist, as I do my work as a director, an actor, a writer, I really try to think of, as Michael was saying, what are we putting on stage? What's our representation of certain people? And for me, making sure that it's something that moves the story forward. There are a lot of narratives, particularly just speaking from my perspective around disability, that reinforce stereotypes, reinforce stigma. It's not that they don't still exist. You can still have people that are living a certain experience with disability, but are they something we've seen before? If so, why are we continuing to tell that story as opposed to expanding our understanding of that identity, of that lived experience in the world? So I really try to, I guess, go to, according to Gandhi, of like, be the change you wish to see in the world. It's so simple, but it's so true. And particularly those of us as creators trying to create those new narratives that don't get the visibility and attention as opposed to reinforcing stale stereotypes.
Yeah, that was definitely thank you for sharing that. In fact, that actually reminded me that I forgot to actually share how I actually adapt my art into my visual impairment. So usually what I try to do is I try to put people in my shoes in terms of, for if it's a video, maybe blurring the background to make them feel like, oh, this is how it kind of feels like walking in his shoes. Or if it's an audio piece, maybe, I ask the viewer or the listener to actually put on headphones so basically they can come into the world that I created, that basically they can kind of virtually kind of understand how I navigate. So that was great. It kind of leads into our next question, which is, what are some systemic barriers that still exist within your industry, and how would you personally break these barriers? So Kent, would you like to go first?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think that's such an intriguing question because in the work that we're doing, when we're thinking about inclusivity and some of the barriers that exist, a lot of it revolves around representation. In fact, with all of the artists who are here, I mean, so much of our work is about telling stories. And when it comes to telling stories, the people who are sharing those stories, and from the perception or from the lens that they're sharing them, it really does matter. And so in our work in specific, the San Diego Asian Film Festival, for example, was founded in 2000 specifically because when you looked on the big screen, you rarely saw Asian Pacific Islanders represented in media. And I know these days we think that a lot has shifted because we look at films like Crazy Rich Asians and, a slew of other films that have won recognition today. But when you look back at even just a study that was done back in 2017, looking at the decade preceding that, just 3% of top film roles or 3% of top film directors were API. And so from that specific lens, we recognize that, it's really difficult when there are very few people actually put in roles to tell those stories. And it's not just whether someone's in front of the camera or the person who's literally right behind it. I mean, it's an entire industry. And so when you think about it from a systemic standpoint, it's really not just who are the storytellers, but who actually gets to make the decisions on who those people are. So it could be screenwriters, it could be producers, it could be the studio executives who make everyday funding decisions. And I think where that plays out from a standpoint of trying to battle what is really systemic is thinking about what kind of work needs to be done to sort of prove that content that is maybe not within the regular sort of stereotype is going to be acceptable. And so that's why I think when you look back at the last couple of years, a film like Crazy Rich Asians became such a popular discussion topic. And it was because that it was a rare moment where a film featuring API cast members and directed by an API director was able to prove viability purely through a box office fundraising, box office number. And it's tough when that's really the metric that allows you to do that. And so for us, our work really is about providing a platform where these voices that might not otherwise get a chance to be heard do have an opportunity to be showcased. They can find an audience, they can find a starting point. And we have filmmakers like Justin Lin would be a really good example, who now is best known for films like Star Trek and a number of the Fast and Furious film series. He started as a shorts filmmaker, right? Like going to small festivals and indie festivals, looking for an opportunity for his work to be recognized. And so for us, there's just a lot of recognition that we play just one small role in the grand scheme of how to change things so that there are more opportunities, more people behind the scenes, and just ways in which we can encourage decisions that would foster, greater diversity within filmmaking and media arts in general.
Gotcha, for sure. That sounds amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that. Reagan, do you have any specific systemic barriers that you would like to share and how you overcame those barriers?
Yeah, and kind of building off of what Kent said, I agree with a lot of that, because I think it is so much about representation. And I think the question is like, oh, but what does representation mean? And what does that look like? And a lot of the time for me, I get questions, like from playwrights or from writers saying, well, am I supposed to write a character specifically to be, a wheelchair user, to be somebody who's blind, or do I just kind of keep it open? And I guess my answer is yes, and yes, like, clearly there's an underrepresentation of a variety of different people with certain social identities, whether it's race, whether it's gender, whether it's ability, disability. So just keep writing, just keep writing and thinking beyond the box in terms of, yes, somebody with a disability can play something that's not written for disability, or they can play a role that is specifically written for a disability. So just, I feel very fortunate. Family, as a theater company, has always done quote unquote established work that they re-envision by putting exclusively actors with disabilities on stage. So what that means is you have Guys and Dolls, you have Man of La Mancha, you have all of these kind of traditional shows that are always done with actors with all different types of disabilities. So that can be spinal cord injury, being blind, being deaf or hard of hearing, being having MS, Parkinson's, cerebral palsy, across the board. And so for the first, the audiences often feel like for the first 15 minutes, I'm watching the bodies. I'm watching through how they move through space. I'm watching like and acknowledging like, oh, that person is different. And then they just settle into the story and they just start accepting those folks as human beings and as performers. So I think there are a lot of barriers about our assumptions about, oh, if somebody's coming into a space with a certain identity, we've got to plug them into our conventional notion of how they fit in the world, as opposed to pushing back against those assumptions and saying, no, what if you have a completely different version or envisioning of this person and how they fit into a story. And most of all, just getting them on stage, getting them on the camera, getting them behind the camera, getting them in the room, and also being open to the feedback. I just recently had a taped audition for a very, very big, long-standing show on TV. And it had some disability content in it that I was just like, ooh, I was kind of did a color poll of like, ooh, maybe that's not the right way you want to talk about that. And I was like, if I got this role, if I was on set, would I be able to give them this feedback, or would then I be seen as like really difficult if I'm saying, you know what, maybe don't use like differently abled. There are different preferred terms in this community. So, being open to the people who actually have that lived experience to provide you, to realize you're not the God of knowing everything. So if somebody gives you some feedback, you're not going to fire them. You're going to say, oh, thank you for that. Geez, that's really great feedback. Let me use that, employ that. So those are just a few thoughts, I guess, for me.
Yeah, excellent point about feedback and listening to feedback. Definitely. Michael, would you like to share what systemic barriers or you have encountered, and how you are overcoming those systemic barriers in your field?
Sure. So, well, I could probably talk an hour just about systemic barriers in the filmmaking industry. Um, it's enough where people with disabilities are so invisible that when Hollywood was undergoing its sort of Oscars too white crisis, they were putting out a sort of census about people in front and behind the camera. And disability was not even on the list of minority. And I often have this discussion with my agent where they'll say like, oh, such and such TV show is hiring minorities. And I'll say, wait a minute, I'm a minority. And they'll say, well, disability is not considered a minority in Hollywood. So it's really an uphill battle. I would like to say I have an answer or a silver bullet as to how to tackle this issue. I can only, do a little bit, do my part, try and bring awareness, some visibility to disability as well as LGBT and other minorities, and try to make it more normalized, as Reagan was saying, bring those bodies to the stage and just making more of the lexicon of the way people live, and allow people to see that it's not abnormal. It's abnormal, but it's not wrong. It's not gross. It's not something that we need to be afraid of. So that's what I try to do.
Yeah, great. Definitely empowering. Because to kind of build on top of that, I personally have experienced that this space that we work in, like the media space, it's a very competitive space. Now, what I realize is a lot of experienced video professionals, video producers, they do not want to work with me as a video maker with a low vision. Now, unfortunately, what they don't realize, and they're kind of blind at this, which is these film sets are big, are big sets that contain a group of people. It's not just one person. So a lot of people don't realize that I personally can do more audio work, and they just kind of overlook that because they're like, "Oh, you're blind to low vision, so therefore you can't overlook that." So for me, a great example is in my visual arts classes. Sure, I might not be able to see the image well enough, but as someone who participates in that class, I make sure to critique the audio because unfortunately, a lot of video producers forget that audio is a plays a big role in delivering your message. And if your audio is spotty, then it breaks your audience's attention. So that's what I basically realized. And then that kind of basically leads into my next question, which is there are a lot of assumptions made about a person's identity. It could be race, gender, disability, etc. Describe an assumption that another person made about you and how you personally handled that assumption. Reagan, you want to begin?
Yeah, I'll share a couple quick anecdotes. One, so I worked at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival for a season as part of the rep acting company up there, and I was on the streets of Ashland one time rolling, and I think this guy, I came across this guy. I think he might have been on some substances or something, but he looked at me and he pointed at me and he said, "You're only that way because you choose to be." And I was like, that's really interesting. And I was assuming that he was meaning the fact that I was using a wheelchair. And I think that's representative. I don't know what his current headspace was at the time, but I think that's also currently or very representative of a larger kind of really underlying subversive opinion about people with specifically people with disabilities, that like there's some measure of choice in living the way that we live. There's this idea that we're trying to take advantage of the system and that we say we have disabilities because as though it's fabricated, or that like if I don't return to walking, that's because I haven't worked hard enough to do it, or so if you know science, like paralysis based on a spinal cord injury, like that's not something that I really have control over. But I think the problem is, again, disability is so diverse. So there are people who have had spinal cord injuries that return to walking, but there's not an acknowledgement of, right, everybody can live a different version of that that categorization or that identity. So again, I guess the reminder that like disability is not a chosen, it's not something that people choose to adopt or choose to embody. Another quick anecdote, when I was also up at Ashland, there were just so many different experiences up in Ashland, but there were some patrons once where I was out on the bricks outside the theater and I had just come out of a show, and they kind of looked at me and they're like, "Oh my gosh, like, oh wait, were you the actor that was just on stage?" And I said, "Yeah, I was." And they looked at my wheelchair and said, "Oh, but how do you do that? You're an actor and you use a wheelchair. How do you act? How do you get on stage?" Because there was such a disconnect. Like they had never thought about, oh, if you see someone on stage in a wheelchair, they could also come off the stage and still be in the wheelchair. Because we've got such an assumption that like, that's just something that you're going to wear as a prosthetic on stage. And then we can trust that the actor, when they remove themselves from that space, they're going to, take off the wheelchair, take off the disability. And there was just that very base level of like, they couldn't even compute how a person with a disability or a person using a wheelchair would actually get on stage to do the acting, which I thought was very profound. And so clearly there was a base level also assumption that like that was not something that was available to me as a human being living with a disability. So I think which kind of goes to just the dehumanization that a lot of different social identities experience, of just not even thinking that they're at the place of just being human beings that have all the options open to them in life, us in life, that other people do. Partly because there have been, histories where we didn't have those options open to us. But now as we change environments, as we make them more accessible and inclusive, I think really changing that base understanding of like, yes, somebody in a wheelchair can be an actor on stage.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. Um, Michael, would you like to share an assumption that you experienced and how you overcame that assumption?
Sure. This doesn't necessarily have to do with filmmaking, but when I read this question, I immediately had this, I flashed back to this memory I had in high school. Um, in high school, I had an assistant that would, and I still have assistants that would help me, with textbooks and other physical needs I have. And one day we had a substitute teacher for AP English, and we were doing some busy work assignment. I forgot what it was. But after he explained what the assignment was, he approached my assistant and asked my assistant if I was able to talk. And my assistant said, you can talk to him directly. You don't need an interpreter. And yet he still spoke to my assistant. And I tried to talk to him, and he still spoke to my assistant. He would not even look me in the eye. It was the most bizarre and dehumanizing moments of my life. And that was during high school, where I was already, when you're in high school, you're dealing with, you already feel like crap, dealing with social pressure. So, that's just something that stood out to me. And I think if we just had more visibility, more um, acceptance of people that are disabled, that we wouldn't have. I mean, I'm sure that guy didn't mean anything bad. He was an older gentleman, and I think he was just not. He was so unused to seeing people like myself in a classroom setting that he did not even see me. It was, it was just bizarre, and that's something that I've always wanted to help correct.
Yeah, I completely understand that feeling because I personally have been a victim of that too. So the professor or the teacher would actually speak to my assistant rather than me in high school. I completely understand that feeling. It's definitely a feeling that, let's just say, um, definitely bringing awareness will definitely I hope will basically bring awareness to those people who might not mean bad, but like to for them to think inclusively that basically people with disabilities are people, and we want to be treated like every other human being. So with that, Kent, would you like to share an assumption that was made about you and how you overcame that assumption?
Sure. I mean, maybe related to it and not so much just myself personally, but I think everyone has probably dealt with some level of assumptions being leveled at them, right? For various reasons. Like it's easy to think that, and I get it, like as a person of color, there's maybe some automatic element of that because just of the way you might look, but I think it applies in so many cases. Um, and and what's really interesting is just thinking of like where those assumptions come from, because while there are times that they are certainly malicious, I think what Michael shared, I mean, and what Jimmy had shared, I mean, there are so many times where it's really just that people have some implicit misunderstanding or bias that just they don't even understand themselves. And so, I mean, on a personal level, I've of course been asked everything from guesses to what uh, country I might be from, even if I was born here, or what language I might speak, or jokes about being great at math, which I happen to actually be decent at math, I guess. But I mean, those are just sort of all examples of, in many cases, they're not meant to be malicious. And what I'm left with trying to figure out is I need to decipher what the intention is, because there are plenty of moments where it's actually, for good or for bad, easier to shrug things off. And then there are other moments where perhaps there are moments that are powerful for teaching. And so maybe the one specific example I would give is actually organizationally, because again, reflecting back on the work that we do, just by saying San Diego Asian Film Festival comes with a lot of assumptions. And the biggest one that I always share with folks that is so intriguing is that the most common question we get asked is, are your films subtitled? And it's surprising how often that comes up, really unintentionally, with no, it's just an honest question, to which I have to point out to folks that half of our films are Asian American. They're in English. And in those cases, they aren't subtitled, but immediately you recognize that when people hear Asian, they jump to thinking foreign film in a different language. And so, yeah, so it's just sort of an example of, that is many times a teaching moment in order to, share with folks that our work is much even broader and than they think. And that frankly, there are films that we receive that are from all over the world that are still in English, and so it's quite a bit of an assumption to assume that it would just automatically be in a foreign language. So that would be my, particular example.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much for sharing that. That actually leads into our last question, which is reflecting on your experience as a student at UC San Diego. What is one change that you believe will make the campus experience more inclusive for all people? Now, I will begin this by basically saying, I think the biggest change that I would like to see is to have these discussions, having disability discussions or race, gender discussions in DEI courses and around the campus. Now, from dance to computer science, this will benefit all of the students and faculty. Now, having this conversation will allow more more people to think inclusively, and don't just present the problem. Get a person to talk about the potential problems and also maybe 3 to 5 things that they would like to see changed. And of course, then the faculty and students will take these and then basically they learn from this experience, because the last thing you want to do is to assume, and assuming is always not the best way to be inclusive sometimes. So bringing this to the attention of faculty, staff, and students will allow them to bring this into their projects that they work in the future on, and also maybe even the jobs that they work on in the future. So therefore, creating a more inclusive world for all. So in terms of to talk more about this, Kent, would you actually like to start this off?
Yeah, I think I would have a very similar answer, because I don't know that there is one solution other than that these kinds of conversations need to happen everywhere. Because I think this kind of interaction and to be able to hear from different perspectives is what helps shape, people's perspectives. And on campus, that's not just in the classroom, it's not just in social activities, but it relays into things like housing, and other elements around access around campus. I mean, I think that's why if there are more opportunities to engage in these conversations, and if staff and student leaders and others are sort of engaged from a training perspective, then there's a better opportunity, I think, to shape how inclusion is sort of addressed from a campus holistic standpoint. So yeah, so I mean, I would certainly agree that that having these conversations would be the starting point.
Yeah, definitely. Michael, would you want to add one specific change you would like to see the university adapt?
Yeah, so I'm going to sound like a broken record, but I would just go back to increasing visibility, more disabled faculty, more disabled students. When we have when we read books, more books by disabled authors, and film, and let's just make it more normalized, more out in the sphere. And when we're talking about minorities, let's include disability. And I think things like this are a great step, and I think it's awesome to have these discussions now. And I'm really happy that and honored that this is happening, and I think it's a good first step on making things better.
I agree. I'm so glad that I have this honor to actually to talk about this as well. Reagan, would you like to talk about one specific thing you would like to see the university bring accessibility and inclusivity to all visitors?
Yeah, and I think this was actually a difficult thing for me to think about because I had a really wonderful experience at UCSD in terms of just in a variety of ways, both in my department and also campus wide in terms of accessibility. But I do think a couple of things. One is just making sure that there are accessibility resources available to anyone that might want them. So for instance, if a student group is doing a presentation, if the local breakdancing club is wanting to do something and they want to incorporate audio description or something like that, making sure that they know they have a resource where that can also be covered like by the university. Because I think sometimes it can feel really overwhelming if you don't really know where to start. And so just making sure that those resources are really visible for not just big, huge campus events, but also for the smaller, little things that might be going on. So students can choose to make their events and their groups more accessible. And then I think a second piece is just, one of my favorite things when I was at UCSD is that I had a friend who was studying in neuroscience at UCSD. And so we would get together and just talk about like how we were both pursuing similar passions from different avenues. I was in theater and the arts, she was in neuroscience, but we had a lot of overlap there. And in some ways, just that, as Kent was saying, like backing away from assumptions you're going to make about somebody, like just reinstituting empathy and passion, because ultimately we're all human beings, regardless of what our external identities, social identities are. So how can we kind of refocus on like, yes, I'm Reagan, I have a disability, but I also have a huge passion for certain stories, for certain experiences, for talking about neuroscience and the intersection with theater, and so how do you also craft those opportunities so that we're and then by showing up in that space as a person with a wheelchair, then you're also humanizing me as a person with a disability just to be in that space and be able to share my passion. So I guess just not only stopping at what we present externally, but digging into who are these unique human beings, what are their passions, and being able to connect in that way.
Yeah, that's amazing. Excellent point, especially about the having the resource to go to on campus to actually point them to how to get funding about audio description or captioning. I think that's a very important thing because a lot of campus departments, come to the OSD to ask, and we try to direct them. But however, of course, it's always a money situation. They don't know how to, approach that. So with that, I would like to open it up for questions and questions to the audience. Eliza, would you like to read like some of the questions so any of us can answer it?
Sure. I think a great follow-up question to the last question that you just asked, Jimmy, was how did your experience at the university inform your work in equity in the arts now? And anyone can chime in.
I think that's a great question. So for me, I think it's definitely an eye opener. Like what I said at the beginning of the presentation, which is I tried to put artists into my shoes when I create content. By either blurring the video or creating audio installations that you need to wear headphones to get into the location. Without that type of thinking, I probably wouldn't, without coming to UC San Diego and actually having this type of, these classes to actually think differently, I probably wouldn't think that way about art. And being at the OSD, that also makes me realize, oh, captioning is of course not just for deaf and hard of hearing people. It's for people who are have ESL or might have basically they might be a visual learner. So that's why having this experience, being at the university and also graduating from here, definitely it has definitely changed how I see art and see how I approach all of my media projects.
I'll say from my perspective, one thing that really attracted me to UC San Diego's theater department and the MFA program was that there's a different philosophy. So a lot of the MFA training programs, especially back east, are kind of like about taking actors, breaking them down, and then building them back up in their image. And I think one of the things that I loved about UCSD was they were looking for people who were already very unique in their identities and how they came into the world. And then it was just about enhancing that. How do you have the toolbox as a performer to use your instrument, even if your instrument is coming with wheels instead of feet? How can you still approach it to make it a better version of itself and a more pliable flexible version of itself as an artist? So I appreciated that it wasn't like we're trying to strip you down and make you into what we want you to be. It's more about how do we give you the tools to be a more versatile version of yourself. And I really appreciate that.
Yeah, I agree. Definitely.
Kent or Michael, do you want to chime in?
Sure. Yeah, being at UCSD was a terrific eye-opener in terms of, I think it was the first time I was really out of my bubble in the sense that I was exposed to people of different genders, sexual identities, from diverse racial backgrounds. Just, the full gamut of humanity. And it was a huge, learning experience, just not only in the academia, but just in experiencing other people. And, besides my own disabled story that I have in my head. So I think, yeah, it was a tremendous way to broaden my view of humanity and really informed me as an adult and a filmmaker.
Yeah, I think maybe what I would add is that I actually don't come from an arts background, and that was not part of my study at UCSD. And so I think where my experience at UCSD may have informed my work today is actually as being a student at Thurgood Marshall College and going through the Dimensions of Culture program. and having an opportunity to sort of have my, even as a person of color, having your own eyes open to, the shared experiences in various communities, and reflecting on that, and how, in coming out of the university, how we can make an impact. So I think for me, actually, the experience really did come from a very different educational element, that I think has had a big factor in terms of shaping my work.
Yeah. And one last thing I would like to add is basically, I always tell students when this is the best time at UC San Diego. You are part of this university that has a lot of faculty, staff, and students. So really get to network, even though you might be shy and you feel like your disability, you can't get out of it, or maybe the way, like your identity, you can't get out of it. Definitely try to interact with as many people as possible, because who knows, you might have an opportunity to work on a project with another one of the individuals that you networked with. You just never know. So I always say, go out and network. And at UC San Diego, I got that chance to do it. And I think everybody else should definitely take that opportunity and really get to meet people.
Great. Thank you all for your responses. I think we have time for one last question. So this one's from Kevin. How, as an audience member or consumer of art, can we signal that we also want a wider variety of stories and perspectives? Michael?
Could you repeat that, please?
Sure. How, as an audience member or consumer of art, can we signal that we also want a wider variety of stories and perspectives?
Well, I think just patronizing these films, plays, media experiences that have these that have the wider variety of people in them. I think telling word of mouth is very important, because not a lot of these have the media advertising exposure that a big Hollywood production might have. So word of mouth, and just patronizing the people that put on these productions. And what also helps is just, if you like something, send the curator an email, because as an artist, that really doesn't go a long way, is saying when you appreciate something from an artist, because I don't know if you know this, but we're very self-centered people. No, I'm just kidding. But we're very soft when it comes to taking in criticisms, and it makes our life when we hear something positive. So, yeah.
Thanks, Michael. Does anyone else want to chime in?
Yeah, I'll just say I really agree with Michael. I think use your voice. Communicate when you like something that you've seen. If there's something you want to see more of, if there's something that you feel like is not the type of thing that you think is moving the conversation forward, that feedback is really helpful to communicate. And I'll say, like, to another question that was in the chat too about criticism and theory and invisibility to visibility. It's also, communicate when there's something that supports the right energy. So from a disability perspective, I think, things that reinforce shame in disability is not what we want to continue to see. So if you see something that is kind of reinforcing that perspective, push back against it, give that feedback. That really disability too can be an identity of pride. And I think that's, yeah. So support pride in terms of these identities and what you see.
Great. Anyone else before we get to close?
I might just add, I think I referred to it earlier, but sometimes there's this frank reality that that what speaks, in terms of getting stories shared, comes in like support through the channels that people will actually see and hear. And so I tell people that if you see film or stories that you want to shared and be told, you have to, most of the time, actually support it financially, right? Whether that's by buying a ticket and actually showing that there's an interest. That is, at the end of the day, sometimes the one measure that gets sort of marked in terms of whether something can be successful or not. So there's no way of avoiding that. That is just a reality of how people will make decisions. But there is a lot beyond that. I mean, being able to share it and to echo and advance a cause these days, especially through social media and in really just non-traditional media ways, can be very powerful. And we've certainly seen a number of films, projects, stories that end up having traction because there was interest shown. And frankly, as a smaller regional film festival, we wouldn't exist without people seeing the value of getting each individual audience member or each individual community supporter. And so what we see is that filmmakers will come share their product, but they will also really be looking for those people who will help advance their cause, whether it's to share it with a couple of friends so that when they head to the next city, someone will be there ready to watch. Or in some rare cases, people get connected to a story that they feel really passionate about, and they end up finding ways to personally support that in some form or fashion. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Kent. Jimmy, do you have anything else you'd like to share and you want to close out the session for us?
Yeah, I would just basically wanted to echo everybody's talking, which is definitely network, and really support the small projects that you see around. Go to one of these film festivals and enjoy, because that's how these these little guys actually make it onto like the big screen. So it's very, very important to actually bring your voice into that as a consumer that way. So to close it out, I want to say thank you so much to all the awesome panelists, and thank you to UC San Diego Alumni for allowing us to participate at this year's Trenton Leaders Conference. I hope that we will have this conversation and continue this conversation, and you learn something from this conversation and continue it in a future panel or discussion. So thank you so much for coming today, and I hope to see you all soon.
A huge thank you, Jimmy, and to all our panelists today. We really appreciate this incredible discussion and conversation this past hour. We hope everyone can continue to join the conference. We have another set of great sessions beginning at 11:15. And also, again, apologies, we couldn't get to everyone's questions, but we're continuing the conversation on Triton's Connect. We have an advancing equity group, so make sure to join there to be able to continue these great discussions and connect with one another as we build this great community. Thanks again, and I really hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.